Good evening, folks, and so glad that you all joined with us tonight for another session of All in the Family. As you can see, things are a little bit different than in previous evenings. Andrea cannot be with us tonight, so I'm pinch hitting for her. So bear with me, this is a new experience. Our guest tonight is Billy Vial, and of course you know that we just celebrated, or he just celebrated his 100th birthday, and there's not enough time tonight to cover 100 years. And so this is really going to be different because we're going to be skipping around a little bit and not go in consecutive order. We'll be skipping around from story to story, and there might even be a surprise ending. I want you to know I met Billy and his wife Winnie when I moved here in 2013. And I found out that dining with Billy is an experience in itself. His stories are fascinating and entertaining and sometimes educational. Almost every time I learned something I did not know. Billy and Winnie were among the first to move into a cottage here at Covenant Woods when it opened in 2001. And until recently, you may have enjoyed a tour around campus in Billy's golf cart. I remember taking a ride, so he was very generous to share his golf cart and take people around the campus to see what was growing, what was blooming, or just to know where things were, right?
Well, I tried to do the best I could.
Yes, you did. If you all recall, up until not too long ago, we also had the little newsletter called Ramblings Through the Woods. For those of you who remember Bev Lordy and Billy were the driving forces for starting that little newsletter, and it ran for a good 6-7 years.
It ran a right good spell.
It did. It ran a right good spell. The very first issue, on Volume 1, Issue 1, the 6 of us that got together each contributed a story. Now, if you have not seen Ramblings Through the Woods, or you'd like to review a little bit, I know you can't see all of this, but this is a white notebook, and there's a copy of all of the issues of Ramblings Through the Woods. There's this copy that's in the lodge here, in the lobby here at the lodge. And there is another copy that's in the library. But if you go to the very first issue, on the very first page is Billy's story. And let me be sure I'm going to read this correctly. The first issue, his story was entitled Pleasures in the Middle of a War. And he shares an incident that involved LCIs. Now, if you don't know what those are, read the story. All right, so now, for those of you who don't know Billy, I'd like to introduce you to Billy Vial, our honored centenarian, is that the right
Well, that's one of the words they call me, but I've been called a lot of things.
Uh-oh. Well, I found out that Billy's a local boy. You want to tell us a little bit about where you were born?
Well, I was born on the corner of Carolina Avenue and Meadowbridge Road. And when I was born there, that was a dirt road. It did have a streetcar tracks running down it. And I can remember as a little fellow watching them put down the paving bricks underneath that tar there on Meadowbridge Road in the city as or brick. And then they tarred over it and fixed it up.
Things have changed over the years.
Oh, yeah.
But when I was talking with Billy, and we were talking about education, one comment he made, he said he got a good part of his education from the Meadowbridge Pharmacy. Now, I want him to share with you how that happened.
Well, what it was, when they widened Meadowbridge Road, my dad had to move our house a bit, and it took up a part of his garden space. So, but he didn't think he would want to keep on gardening, so he decided to build some stores there on what had been his garden plot, and one of his stores was a drugstore, and they had what you call a reclining magazine rack. And when I got old enough to be reading things, Life magazine came out, and that was brand new. That was a very exciting type of magazine. There was a photo magazine, and it also had a lot of stories in it and so forth. And the pharmacists didn't seem to mind, and I would get behind that magazine rack and sit there and read a Life magazine and from cover to cover. And I really thought that was a great deal part of my education, because I was, as a kid, I was learning things that the other kids didn't know, and they would come and talking to me about things, and I could tell them about what I'd read in Life magazine, and it was fun. And then, of course, other magazines started coming in, like Liberty and Time and so forth like that. And one of the other things I'll tell you about, there was a newspaper that used to come. It was published in Washington, and it came in the drugstore on Wednesdays, and it had the funny papers in there that would go be in the Richmond papers on Sunday. So I would wait till that came in, and I'd read all the funny paper, and they had a thing like what we have, this parade type of thing, but on the cover it was always science fiction. Well, I'm going to tell you something about that later, because that came towards the end of World War II. In fact, right at the end of World War II. What I found out in that magazine, in the paper that would come in on from Washington on Wednesdays.
Okay. I know that you said something about you were always surrounded with good friends.
Well, for some reason, two of my closest friends in high school, and my summer friend that I played with down on the Rappahannock in the summertime, they were really much smarter than I. I have to give them credit. They were brilliant. And the two boys I ran around with in high school, they both became doctors. This other boy could have done anything in this world he wanted. Somehow or another, he wound up as a manager of a paper company up in Baltimore, and had a good life. But I learned a lot from them. They were brilliant, and they seemed to put up with me, and I hung in there with them and tried to absorb what I could from them.
Well, maybe some of those things that you read in the Life magazine you shared with them, and maybe that helped them as well.
Oh yeah, well I would tell them, and of course I learned a whole lot in the Brooklyn Theater over on Brooklyn Park Boulevard. My dad's office was over at North Avenue and Brooklyn Park Boulevard, and I could always slip in there and get a dime from him. And he was, somebody asked him, well, you don't want him watching all those movies? And he said, well, at least when he's in the theater, I know where he is. So I think he thought it was safer for me to be in the movie than anywhere else.
Yeah, in the movies back then, it was quite a thing that you could go and stay for a pretty good while.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was a wandering kid, and I think that was one of the things that they never knew when I left the house where I would be. I always got back in time for supper, except maybe once or twice.
When I was talking with Billy, he told me something that occurred in grade school, that there was a particular individual that showed up occasionally, And I think he said his name was Marvin, but I'm not sure.
Well, no.
Tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, it wasn't Marvin, but I think Marvin was putting this kid up to this. This boy was a right good size, and I'm sorry to say he had some mental problems, I think. And Marvin wanted him to learn how to fight, I think. So he would sick this larger kid than I on me. But like I say, he had some problems, and he would come swinging at me, and I didn't even know he was coming. I didn't know where he came from. And I could hit him, but I could duck him too. And so the last time it ever happened, Marvin decided, well, he will get in, break it up, and then he'd show him how to beat me up. So he and I were going at it strong, and the caretaker at school had to come in and catch us both by the collar and drag us back into the building and told us to get to our classes. And I don't think I ever really laid eyes on Marvin or that other boy after that. I don't know. They didn't live in my part of Highland Park, so I don't really know where they lived. But the other boy, the one that had a little mental difficulty, he would just show up and want to fight, and I think Marvin was putting him up to it.
Well, but that finally ended, so you didn't have to deal with it anymore.
Nevermore.
One thing he did share that he attended John Marshall High School, and I know there are quite a few other people living here that also attended John Marshall. I think you told me that you were part of the Cadet Corps.
Oh yes, I was in the Cadet Corps, and that was one of the pleasures of my high school. That I was very proud of being a John Marshall Cadet, and I think we had 2 or 3 of them, people that are here now that were in the John Marshall Cadet.
Okay, at that point in time, I think when he was a senior and Winnie was a senior, he really hadn't noticed her too much.
Well, I was a captain, and I was on the staff, and most of my duties had to do with being in the commandant's headquarters, and I wasn't in my homeroom very often.
So you all were in homeroom together?
We were in the same homeroom, and I went back to my desk for something during the day, and I must have been recess time or something, because Winnie was sitting there at her desk right next to my desk, and I reached in my desk and there was a bunch of sewing in there. I didn't know where in the world that came from, so I pulled it out and said, where did this come from? So Winnie told me it was hers. And I said, well, I'll put it back, and that was the first time I'd ever even noticed her, because I was so seldom in the homeroom. Well, after that, I noticed that in those days you might have some classes in the WIF building and some in the John Marshall building, and it had a tunnel. And it so happened that shortly after that, I noticed that she was going through the tunnel at the same time I was, so I started walking with her through the tunnel, and, well, that's what happened, and we wound up married for 74 years.
When he was sharing that with me, he was telling me that at the time she was taking, I guess, home ec.
Yeah.
She was taking sewing, and she wanted to take her project home with her, right?
Yeah, but she wasn't supposed to take that sewing home. It was supposed to stay in the class, and
So she hid it in your desk.
Yep. So she brought it out, and she didn't have room in her desk for it, and mine was fairly empty, so she stuck it in my desk.
So that little sneaky thing triggered a lifetime connection.
Yep.
You all, if you've been around Billy at all, you know that he's always encouraging folks to write down stories or remembrances to share with others, with their children, their grandchildren, or whomever.
Mostly for the grandchildren. I think that I know, and I think most of you folks that may see this realize that you knew very little about actually the life of your grandchildren, of your grandmother and grandfather. You knew their names, and you knew something. And somebody in the family usually was full of genealogy, but that was just names. That didn't tell a thing about the person. And I think it's a shame when a place like Covenant Woods, the number of people that are here, the stories that are in this complex, there's some wonderful, wonderful stories in this building. And they ought to be written down and have grandchildren and their children even could enjoy them.
So now you know why Billy agreed to this interview. His ulterior motive is to get you all busy.
Well, really and truly, when I talked to Linda, I was more interested in talking to you than I was having talk about myself, because I'm just an old geezer and I've lived a good life, and I have a few stories, sure, and I tried to write down some of them, and I enjoyed doing it.
Billy, when did you start writing them down?
Well, when I retired, I never wrote anything of any that anybody would ever read until I retired. And Winnie had retired, but she was bored. She wanted to, so she took a part-time job, and I was sitting at home with a computer. So I just started writing. I wrote what I consider the great American novel, which will never be published and probably never read by more than a handful of people. But anyway, that got me started, and then I got to thinking about writing things for my daughter.
Well, we're going to go back a little bit. Your career was as an optician.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about how that came about.
Well, I was working in the bank, and I really didn't enjoy working in the bank. And a friend of mine worked for the Gillespie Optical Company, and he was one of the founders there. Well, actually, his daddy was one of the partners of it. And they needed somebody, and I had conversations with him because he was a friend of a family, and his wife was a family that had friends to my family back to my grandparents, actually. And so he talked to me about it, and I said, well, yeah, I'd like to try that. So I went to work for Gillespie Optical Company in their laboratory and learned to cut glass and put them in frames and make the frames so that they would be proper. And it was interesting. And yeah, I was doing that for probably a year and a half or so.
And then what happened?
Well, then I knew that I would soon be drafted. There was a war was going on, and they advertised that they wanted opticians. And I thought, well, I guess I'd rather go on and do that. I had seen pictures of the truck that they used to make eyeglasses and follow the troops and repair them and remake glasses that they broke. So anyway, I volunteered to do that, and I got a big surprise. They sent me up to Aberdeen Proving Grounds, and what they wanted with opticians was to teach them about rangefinders and binoculars and telescopic lens and things of that sort, and how to repair those because they would get broken very easily on on artillery pieces and things. So I wound up in the school there in Aberdeen, and actually for the first time I was a good student. I never was much of a student in the schools. I passed, but my good friends were always making A's, and I won't make an A's by any means. So anyway, to make a long story short, I learned to repair optical instruments that the Army used. And then another strange thing happens. Get transferred to a medium maintenance company, which was normal. That's what they did with it, where I was supposed to go. But somehow or another, this medium maintenance company had been attached to the Air Corps up at the Westover Field in Massachusetts. Well, I don't know. I went up there. They had already filled all of their people. They didn't really need me. And here I'd made good grades and I had nothing to do. And so I was stuck. I was with them. And I was up there for several months, and they moved us down to Bridgeport, Connecticut, or rather just outside of Bridgeport. And we were close to the aircraft factory.
Now, this is something that you all are going to find really interesting. This is where I told you that talk to Billy and you get an education, because he did share something with me at that time, and I want him to share it with you tonight. So tell us what you witnessed while you were at Bridgeport.
Well, while we had a camp outside near this airport, and we'd look up and we'd see this thing flying around with a big whirlwind on top and a little propeller on the back of it, and an old guy sitting up there, and there was no body on it at all, just a bunch of pipes and things that holding it together. And the old guy was sitting up there with a felt hat, and he had his hands on two controls, and he was flying all around over our barracks and around, and never very high, just flying and seeing what he could do with his machine. And we found that it was Igor Sikorsky. I think his name was Igor, I'm not sure. But anyway, that was Sikorsky, and he was at that moment had invented the first successful helicopter. They'd had autogyros, which were somewhat different, but not nearly as flexible as a helicopter. And he was the first one to come up with a helicopter that really actually worked. And the helicopters you see today all sprung from his experimenting and his designs and so forth.
Yeah, when I Googled it, immediately came up pictures of today's helicopters. And it says that Sikorsky Aircraft is an American aircraft manufacturer. It's still around. It's based in Stratford, Connecticut, and was established by the famed aviator Igor Sikorsky in 1923, and was among the first company to manufacture helicopters for civilian and military use.
That's right.
And it's still doing it today.
Well, Sikorsky had been in the aircraft business long before he developed a helicopter. He was famous for making big, what we refer to as flying boats. There were, I think Pan Am used to use them rather than because they could land on water, and they would fly up and down the Caribbean, and they stretched out, and then later they couldn't carry as many passengers and so forth. So Sikorsky decided he'd go in and do something else and did away with his 4-engine flying boats.
Well, if you really want to see a picture of the original, what you witnessed, it is on Google. It's not the first picture that comes up, but you can see Mr. Sikorsky with his hat.
Yeah. Yeah, every time we
Earmuffs and
saw him, he had an
everything.
old felt hat pulled down over his head.
Well, I know that at some point in time with the Air Corps that you were in North Africa. I know you have another story that involves Jimmy Doolittle.
Well, when we got to North Africa, they found out that medium maintenance company really was a mistake to be tied to the Air Force. And so they broke it up, and they sent the various parts of that group to different places. And I was sent to the 319th Bomb Group. The 319th Bomb Group originally was started by the survivors of Jimmy Doolittle's raid on Tokyo. And they were the cadre for it. And but when I got to North Africa and was transferred, the Doolittle aviators had already flown their missions, and several of them were lost. And I don't think they flew to 25 missions like most planes did. I think they felt like those men were kind of like national treasures. They sent them back to the States for training other people and possibly going around to raise bonds and things of that sort. But the one that happened to be commander just before I got there, he was on a bomb run there in North Africa, and they dropped their bombs, and then they started back to the airfield, and he decided he didn't know if they'd done the damage they wanted to do, and he turned back to see what happened, and he wound up a prisoner of war. And if you ever saw the movie Doolittle's Raid, they spoke his name very often for some reason. He was named Davy Jones. And Davy Jones spent the rest of the war a prisoner of the Germans. But Doolittle himself would often come from time to time and visit the 319th Bomb Group. And I think Colonel, the boy that rose to be colonel by the time I got there, seemed to be like, I think Doolittle thought he was kind of a kindred spirit. I think he felt like that boy was, he was young. He was 27 years old and a colonel. But he was excellent. He was a great flyer. And they were making changes in the B-26 and what to do different purposes than what they had originally thought they were going to do. But anyway, the funniest story I ever ran into with Jimmy Doolittle was we had a little young fellow that was an excellent mechanic. He was very small, very skinny, and he was tending to his airplane. He was in charge of, he was the crew chief of that plane, and he was working on it. And he had his hands all greasy, so he's wiping them off. And the Jeep pulls up, and some officers jump out, and they sign the papers that they have over there for him to take the plane out, so if anything happened, that everybody knew who was on the plane and knew who took it off, and that they had authority to do so. So anyway, Ole was washing his hands, trying to get them clean. And all of a sudden, he looks over there, and his airplane is shimming and shaking. Whoever was the pilot had set the brakes tight. And it was revving the engine up much higher than anybody he'd ever heard of, running engines up like that on airplanes on the ground, because the whole plane was vibrating and shaking and carrying on. He couldn't stand it. So he runs under the plane and goes up under there and goes up into the cockpit and reaches over and pulls back on the controls, and he says, "I don't care what you do when you take this plane up in the air, but you don't treat it like that on the ground." And he pulled those things, stopped, and the guy turned around and looked at him, and he had a row of stars, and that was Jimmy Doolittle.
That was Jimmy Doolittle.
Paul, he thought sure he was a dead man, but he never heard a thing from it. I know he was worried the whole time that plane was gone, but when he came back, he was going to catch it. But
Well,
nobody ever said a word to him about it.
As you can tell, Billy has lots and lots of stories. After service, tell us what you did when you came back. I know that you worked as an optician.
Well, yes, I had kind of thought I might do something else, and I was looking around, and another fellow came to me, and he knew about me, and he said, "We need a man over at Hall Optical Company right now. We've lost a man that's gone off to work somewhere else, and we need somebody." So I said, "Well, I'll go over and work for them," because I didn't want to go back to Gillespie and then leave with my friend, and just because I wanted to do something else. So I talked to my friend, and I went all over the Hall Optical Company and worked there for about, maybe almost 5 years. In the last year or two, I worked out of the lab. I was working down on the floor, fitting glasses on the patients that brought prescriptions in from the various ophthalmologists and so forth. And I enjoyed that work and met a lot of nice people. And then another fellow came to me and said that he worked for an ophthalmologist, and there was another ophthalmologist that would be interested in talking to me. So I went to work for that was Dr. Perkins, and I worked for him for 30-some years. And he took in a partner in his last years. He had been an excellent surgeon, and he had been an ophthalmologist in the Army during World War II in a unit that was formed at the Medical College of Virginia. And he was a very skilled surgeon. And I enjoyed working for him and stayed with him for 36 years. And then another couple of years for the other fellow, Dr. Wyatt, who came along, and he was very nice. And he retired, and I decided it's time for me to retire too. So I enjoyed my retirement, and I've been retired since about 1987, I think.
Well, I told you that we were going to be skipping around a little bit, going back a little bit more. I'm sure most of you, or at least those that have been here for a little while, are familiar with the Chamberlain Theater. And you are looking at the person who lit the fire to get the Chamberlain Theater started. He was involved in, I think, purchasing the land and getting the...
Well, that was kind of an accident. We were building a civic building, and I was on part of the board of a civic society, civic association, and we were going to build this building and so forth. And to raise money to build the thing, we had a variety show which we did in the school. And so when they were building the building, I suggested that to have a stage in the building so that we could put on a variety building if we needed to boost some money back to keep a building going. And the president of the association happened to be Charlie Todd. And Charlie called me and said, you're the new chairman of the theater group. I knew absolutely nothing about theater. I've never acted in any theater. I'd never thought about acting in a theater. But fortunately, there were enough neighbors in Old Chamberlain Heights and Chamberlain Farms that had been in some shows, and one or two that had even a little professional experience. And I think this last show that they had, I think they probably went out of business now. I think they run that course, and that I was chairman of it for about 5 years, and that was when my daughter was 10 years old, the first time we started the thing. And it just stopped operating now, and she's about 66, I think. So it ran quite a while.
Been around for a while. I know you shared that one thing that got started during that period of time, that you and Winnie started square dancing.
Well, yeah, that was a bunch that most of them belonged to the Baptist church out there. And a boy that lived there in the neighborhood wanted to call, and so they had a square dance club, and I joined the club, and old Jesse Shackelford, who lived here and passed away a year or so ago, and his wife just passed away this past year, he joined the club a year before I did, and we got to be friends, and one night Jesse was in a meeting with us, and after the meeting was over, he said, I'd like to try calling. So we scattered around, got an old turntable, and I had an old speaker, and somebody else had a microphone, and Jesse started calling to teenagers, and those teenagers had a fun. They started out with just under teenagers, and next thing you know, seniors in high school at Henrick, Ohio, joined in, and they had a big time. And Jesse developed his calling for them 2 or 3 years, and then all of a sudden he was calling for the adults, and he got to be the caller for our club, and next thing you know, he was called all up and down the East Coast.
All up and down the East Coast. It was really funny. When I moved here in 2013, Jesse was here, and he was teaching square dancing.
Yeah.
And the man that I had worked with when I taught in the Shenandoah Valley, he and his wife were square dancers. And so when I met Jesse, I said, oh, and he told me what he had done up and down the East Coast. And I mentioned the man's name and his wife, and of course, Jesse knew him, and of course, that was a long way from here. But so you moved here in 2001, you already knew somebody.
Yep.
Yeah. We're getting to the point that we really need to kind of wrap things up a bit, but I did ask Billy, what have you learned in your later years? And he told me something about beer. So tell us about what you learned about beer in your later years.
Well, I never was a real beer drinker, but I did keep some beer in the refrigerator before I came to Covenant Woods, because I had to cut my own grass. And so when I moved to a cottage here in Covenant Woods, there was 3 bottles of beer in my refrigerator. So I put the 3 bottles of beer in the refrigerator in the cottage at Covenant Woods, and I guess they got shoved to the back or something, and I wasn't cutting any grass, and I didn't think about it. And here, a year or so ago, my wife and I decided it was time for us to go to assisted living. Her health was giving her some problems, and I didn't want her to go over by herself and be in the cottage. So we both went to assisted living, and they gave us a rooms that connected, which was very nice of Covenant Woods. And we were very happy with that for a while. And then her health got better, and then she wound up upstairs in the health care. And then came the epidemic, and I was downstairs and she was upstairs, and I couldn't even go up to see her. And that went on for a year, and but the last few weeks of her life, I was able to see her for about 5 minutes at a time. And
But not too long ago, you moved to an apartment, but what about the beer?
well, what happened to the beer was that when I started to bring things to put in the refrigerator in assisted living, and I saw the beer in there. I took the beer out and poured it in the glass, took a sip, and it was some kind of awful. Beer just don't keep that long.
I thought it was really funny when I asked him, tell me something he'd learned in his later years. He said, I discovered that beer doesn't age well.
That's right too, it doesn't. And I don't think I had another beer until I had a cheese sandwich in the fireside. And I had one of the lager beers. And I thought that tasted pretty good of that cheese sandwich. So the next thing you know, I'm asking my daughter to bring me some bottles of lager beer, and I've been drinking Vienna lager beer about once, maybe a day. Well, maybe about 4 beers a week, I think is about what I wind up with.
I've learned that Billy's always had a great imagination, lots of energy, and a sense of wonderment. But you were sharing about what you discovered about your creativity and your activity as a child, and as you came up through, that in your later years you've learned a little bit more about yourself.
Well, like I told you before, I was never a good student. The only place I was ever a real good student, and that was in Aberdeen Proving Ground. And that was because what I was doing was hands-on. They were lecturing, and I was taking notes, but as they were doing it, it was hands-on. You were working with an actual object. And that worked in my way of thinking much better. It didn't give me a chance to do what I did when I was a kid and what I did in the rest of my education. And that was, I found out that I had what they called a memory deficit. I would be reading a book and or studying, even in mathematics. I'd be doing something, and something would make me think of something else, whatever, maybe something in the math even, would make me think of something else. And my mind would go off, and I would be thinking about that, and I never really got deep into my whatever I was supposed to be studying. I didn't do too bad in history because it somehow kept my interest, but like for many of the other subjects, even in English literature or just studying English itself, I'd be working on my homework, and my imagination would pick up something out of that, and I'd be thinking about that. And next thing you know, I've spent the whole evening thinking about something else except what I was supposed to be studying.
So your attention got...
Yeah. My attention was, it was an attention deficit.
So that's something that you've learned a long time.
Well, I didn't really realize that until after I retired.
Right.
I often wondered why I was a poorer student been my smart friends, because in our life and the things we were doing, I was doing everything they were doing just as well and sometimes better. but but it was kind of puzzle to me, and that's and I finally realized that I had a attention deficit syndrome, and evidently it wasn't too bad because, well,
Well, you
let's
made it
let's
this
put it
far.
this way. I earned enough to be able to live here. I've been here for 20 years, and I'm still paying my bills.
Well, we're getting down to the end, and I really want to get to about your writing. Not too long ago, I learned that you found something that you started writing, 30 years ago, and Billy has had it published. So tell us a little bit about what you have there to show them.
Well, I want you people, all the stories and things that you have, if you have a computer, it's easy. If you don't have a computer, it's a little more difficult. But with a computer, it's even way better than the old typewriter, because you could start something and then you say, I didn't put in so-and-so, or I want to change so-and-so. And you can go back and correct it and read it over. And, and even being a bad speller, your spell check on the computer is very helpful. It's not always accurate, but it's very helpful. Well, I got to thinking here lot long ago that the hurricane season was coming along, and I had written something about a hurricane house, but I thought people ought to build their houses if they live on the beach and so forth, to build a house that would at least resist that hurricane and probably survive it. And so I sketched one, and I didn't do anything with it. I had a friend of mine who was an architect. I thought about taking it to him, and I found that he'd passed on. And I thought, well, so-and-so was an engineer, and he always said he could do anything an architect could. So I said, well, I'll talk to him. He'd passed on. So I don't know. I just said, well, I don't know what I'll do with it. I'll just write a story about it. So anyway, I wrote a story about it. And I got printed it up. I had it on, put it on a disc.
Now, what he's not telling you is
What is that there?
that it is a murder mystery
Oh, yes.
tied into.
Well, see, I had to make it a story of some interest. So I decided I'd write a story about two guys that were college roommates, and one of them decided to design a house that would stand the hurricanes because he had taken a job with his parents, with his father, who was in real estate, and he had sold a lot of houses along the coast of Carolina, and they were destroyed, and he felt kind of guilty a little bit about having selling these people the house that's destroyed. And he thought, well, I'll design a house that would probably would have still be there if it built it this way. And he was trying to figure how to do it, and he was waiting for somebody at the airport, and he looked over at the control tower, and he realized that the control tower was shaped like this on an angle. So he designed a house that the walls coming up would bend out to meet the roof that was bent coming down. And he would build it on stilts, on piling, that it would be buried deep into the ground with a mushroom at the bottom, mushroom type of thing to keep it from pulling up. And so I decided to do that, and so I drew that up and had it, but it didn't have anything to do with it. So I decided that I would let this young man that was just in college who had sold some real estate, let him design it. And so those two boys, they were great difference in personality. And they got together and they got one or two houses built, and they were very successful with it. And they went to a college reunion, and the hotshot boy that really is supposed to have designed the thing, he met up with a college with her. He never really had a very good date with her before, but they seemed to hit it off real well at the reunion. And next thing you know...
I'm going to have to interrupt you there because we got just a few minutes, and we need to get to the end. But all of that works together, and the title of the book is?
Well, the title of the book is White Linen Does It, but that has to do with a white linen suit
That's right.
that gets involved in a little trouble, but to have a little death involved.
I got the pleasure of reading the book, Billy, before he got it published, and I want you to are we going to have a copy in the library?
Well, I haven't talked to the library about accepting one. I don't know if they'd be interested. But anyway, see, what I want you people to write your memoirs or some stories that you started, and you could take them to Office Max, and they can print them up in things like this. And it's work. It's not that expensive. I even wrote one for my daughter some years back about my childhood in the summer on the Rappahannock River.
If you go back to the connections that you got for June and you turn to page 8, there's a little article called Your Story Matters that Lisa put in there. And that is to give you a free resource to help you get started drafting your memories to share with whomever you want to, particularly your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. It is not genealogy, but an insight into your life and your experiences and your memories. Please look at page 8 because at the recreation office, they have free copies, or you can ask them to send it to you on the computer if you have one. You don't have to have one to do it. But looking back, it's hopefully later in the year we're going to have a directed program, but you can get started now with writing down a few things and getting ready for that. I want to go back to, I looked up Sylvia Plath, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning American poet, novelist, and short story writer. And I think this applies to Billy. Everything in life is writable about if you have the outgoing guts to do it and the imagination to improvise. So, Billy, I want to thank you so much for sharing your story and to encouraging people. Got any last words?
Well, I just want you to do that because they can make them for you any size. Go down to Office Max and you can have whatever you've written, because I'm sure that there are a lot of stories that people that live here have written, and they've got them maybe on disk in their computer or maybe on a stick.
Or handwritten.
And some are handwritten, and the computers are here. You might could even get someone that was younger than I am and more apt for the computer these days to read what you wrote and put it on the computer for you.
Well, we're getting to the last minute or so. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, and watch for the next session. Hopefully Andrea will be back with us. That will be Wednesday, June 30th. We're not telling you who it is, but same channel, same Same time, same station.
Right.
So join us on the 30th for the next session of All in the Family.
They'll probably have someone much more entertaining than I, because I talk too much. I really wanted to talk more about getting you to write this book than talk about me.
We just want everybody to pay attention to when things are going on, to participate, and to go by the Recreation Department and pick up your copy of How to Get Started. Good night, folks.
Good night. See y'all.